The Academy of Philosophy and Letters, as our name implies, we're interested in arts, letters, the imagination, and beauty. All these things are core to APL's mission. So tonight we are partnering with the National Civic Arts Society to sponsor this event. I will have Justin Shubow come up to introduce tonight's speaker. Justin Shubow is president of the National Civic Arts Society, which promotes classical and humanistic tradition in public art and architecture. He was the 11th chairman of the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts. He no longer is because we aren't allowed to have nice things. So please, Mr. Shubow.
Thank you, Luke. As he said, I'm president of the National Civic Arts Society. I would like to thank the Academy of Philosophy and Letters for co-sponsoring this wonderful event with my organization. Founded in 2002, the National Civic Arts Society is a nonprofit organization that educates and empowers our leaders in the promotion of public art and architecture worthy of our great republic. We do so by advocating for the classical tradition in civic design. We believe that that tradition is unparalleled in its dignity, beauty, and harmony, not to mention its legibility to the common man. It is no accident that the Founding Fathers chose the classical style when designing the nation's capital and its core buildings of government. The founders sought to hearken back to Republican Rome and democratic Athens, and they knew that classical architecture was time-honored and timeless. Classical architecture is not just about unparalleled aesthetic excellence. Our organization believes it is quite simply the architecture of American democracy. It is the style most associated with our system of government and our highest ideals. It is the architecture of civic virtue. Tonight's speaker, C.J. Howard, will be speaking on a perhaps related subject. The title of his talk is The Arrow of Aesthetics, Architecture's Role in Cultural Formation Through Virtue. A talented architect and professor, CJ is principal architect at CJ Howard Architecture. He has spent more than 2 decades practicing in Washington, D.C., in the region. He has extensive experience working for firms nationally known for their commitment to and expertise in classical and traditional design. Since 2017, CJ has also served as assistant professor at Catholic University, where he teaches in the newly launched Classical Traditional Architecture and Urbanism track. CJ has most recently been a lead project architect for McCrary Architects in Washington, D.C., leading the design and construction of major ecclesiastical projects, both to benefit vibrant and growing Catholic communities on university campuses, as well as expanding dioceses. In addition to his ecclesiastical portfolio, CJ has worked on a variety of residential and civic projects, including several urban design projects in collaboration with the District Department of Transportation, proposing visionary new projects for the nation's capital. He also garnered attention for his entries in the design competitions, including a 2008 winning entry for a Contrabands and Freedmen Cemetery Memorial in Alexandria, Virginia. His winning design, chosen from among several hundred entries, was used as the design framework for the memorial that was completed and dedicated in 2014. CJ received both his Bachelor of Architecture and Master of Architectural Design and Urbanism from the University of Notre Dame. Please join me in welcoming C.J. Howard.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Justin and NCAS for your sponsorship here. I also thank Luke and the APL for inviting me. It is an incredible honor to be here. And I don't want to forget the new president, Mr. President, Sean Riley. Yes, it's a great honor to be here, to be speaking with you at this dinner lecture. I was here last night for Colonel McGregor's presentation, and it's a tough act to follow. He's a very powerful man with profound things to say. So, also he's got some experience on me. He said he went through all the dinner time lectures that he's been to. This is my first, so maybe keep that in mind. To compensate for his his sort of speaking off the cuff and not reading and such, I'm going to be showing a lot of photos, so a lot of pretty pictures. I'm a slideshow junkie, so we're going to go for a ride there, and I'll show you some things, but I'll also talk about some things. The other thing I'll say is just sort of as a guardrail, I don't know if you've ever seen the Big Lebowski. I feel a little related to Ronnie there. Is it Ronnie? Yeah. I'm a little out of my element. In speaking with the Donnie, and speaking to the philosophy crowd here. So I'll give it a shot and try to let you into my world as well. And in terms of doing that, Justin, again, thank you for the introduction. But I thought I'd start with saying a little bit more and showing a little bit more about what I do. I don't take it for granted that you know what it is that classical traditional architecture is, in contrast to modernist architecture. But that is what I'm teaching, that's what I practice. And in these slides, starting with a series of them here, you'll see basically what the buildings that are produced from what I teach and what I do, in contrast to what pretty much the rest of the academic and professional world of architecture does. And so I'll just go through a few back and forth togglings of the contrasts here. What I do, what I teach, and again, what is mostly put out there and taught. In terms of churches, this is kind of my wheelhouse, and this is the other way you could look at things. And on. I've got 90 slides, so I gotta go fast, sorry. And sorry, can you see? Yeah, I mean, we could probably take 15 minutes per slide. So you're seeing a theme. This is the last one. And I do try to avoid, in the school that I teach at Catholic University, I do try to avoid trying to feed into the combativeness, but it is also important to me to make contrast, to say and have convictions about the belief values of one particular way of thinking about architecture and doing architecture and the other. And that's kind of where I end this, to say that that's a big part of this talk, to elucidate those ideas, those contrasts in meaningful ways with respect to the aesthetics of architecture. So with that, I will begin the formal part. So I'd like to begin with a biblical reading that fell providentially into my lap a few weeks ago, which seemed to me to suggest an appropriate way to think about how architecture and beauty can relate to morality. The passage is from the second letter of St. Peter. Therefore, I intend always to remind you of these things, though you know them and are established in the truth that you have. I think it right, as long as I am in this body, to arouse you by way of reminder, since I know that the putting off of my body will be soon, as our Lord Jesus Christ showed me. And I will see to it that after my departure you may be able at any time to recall these things. So here I take Peter to be an architect. His given name inferring his foundational capacity as a rock notwithstanding, in reminding any and all to a full participation in something greater than themselves. Peter is hitting on the importance of remembering, and that we need to be reminded with more frequency than that which we learned in the first place. We all forget. My wife can testify to my own phenomenal abilities to forget. Habitual forgetfulness can be especially scary when we consider the more significant things in our lives, needing a sense of identity, relationship, direction, and ultimate purpose. These days, we have a grab bag of values to choose from, But with regard to an objective value set to discuss the likes of architecture and morality, the oldies and goodies of the Aristotelian traditionalism will do. The conventional list of virtues, as seen here, and I assume everybody has memorized, are the subjects of our frequent remembering. The theological virtues of faith, hope, and reason are certainly not intentionally excluded here, but implicit here beyond the veil of this presentation. So, to the point, how on a daily basis can rousing reminders occur to engender moral formation? Maybe a Google Calendar ping or an iPhone morality app, which I actually looked for. This caused me to try to look for a morality app, and it's out there. It's probably not worth a whole lot. So let's begin at the source, with the person. The notion of morality obviously refers to us as the subject matter. Morality being, by one definition, principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong or good and bad behavior. Morals gain their authority through a sense of objective conviction among rational people. For example, reasonable people can agree with conviction that it is objectively wrong to kill somebody without cause. While that is a low-hanging fruit example, there's no easy way to establish absolute rules. Nevertheless, we tend to know what it is when we see it. Sir Roger Scruton, whom I've appealed to for much of the content of this presentation, recognizes a key concept in relating morality and architectural aesthetics. Here he articulates a point of moral influence in the form of a person. The absence of universal laws in morality is not in itself tantamount to subjectivity. The ability to recognize right actions partly stems from an ability to recognize good people, to recognize that a particular action expresses dispositions that one should emulate or praise. Then we can understand what is right and wrong, not because we possess some catalog of rules, but because we understand the motives and feelings of the virtuous person. It will be as objective as the notion of virtue from which it stems. And if it can be shown that our ideal of virtue is not arbitrary, but on the contrary, imposed on us by the very nature of rational choice, then all moral judgments will be in some measure objective, deriving from their validity from reasoning which no one can reasonably reject. That's a mouthful. But that particular quote really is getting at the heart of what I've taken away from his thoughts on this in terms of being able to say with some conviction, having a confidence about objective morality, and then translating that to aesthetics. In the biblical passage, Peter in his Christian community is the object for the ultimate object of morality in Christ. Other examples throughout history, from theologians to political figures to the gal next door, fulfill this important role of moral modelship as figures for imitation. Imitation in the sense that we can take from that model things as they ought to be, giving us deeper insight into the nature of that morality. Reminding and inspiring imitation depends on our relationships and contributions to a greater community. Aristotle's claim that human beings are social animals that need community for the best kind of life, and the paradox of wanting to have both communal belonging and individual freedom is likely familiar to everybody here. The notion of individualism, on the other hand, as a floating entity, an animate object in a funky-shaped husk, just living out existence for the sake of fulfilling desires, denies that capacity. To return to the point then, communities are precisely what enables one person to imitate the moral behavior of another, and in turn be capable of modeling morality themselves in the communal cycle of commemorative virtue. Outside of a wise friend, a charitable family member, or community leader, where or how else might we find rousing reminders toward morality and virtue to imitate? Can I interest you in some frozen virtue? And trust me, these are much more fulfilling than the froyo you might be familiar with. Representational art, as seen in figures of virtue such as these, as sculpted on buildings, as freestanding figural objects, or rendered in polychromatic two-dimensional splendor, appeal to our senses primarily through visual narrative means. These somewhat literal gestures and narrative depictions of morality and virtue are impactful as reminders and vehicles for lessons as quasi-human models. They stand for an idea or subject by telling a story through representation. So we've got a few slides here. I'll go through similar to the beginning of different versions of this. But this one in particular is more personal, a little bit about my background. I'm a military brat. My dad was in the Army. We lived in Germany for about 5 years. And we took field trips and family trips to different cities in Germany, like Cologne. And one of my strongest memories is approaching a cathedral, a Gothic cathedral in particular. And I would be taking the route seen in the right photo, and just being completely taken by the whole scene. But on approach, getting closer and closer, the entry portal typically had some sort of interesting amalgamation of figures that were scary, yes, a little intimidating, but just like could not get my attention off of them. And I think they were doing their job, right? Like they were doing that aesthetic thing of capturing attention and then leading towards something else. Notre Dame and Strasbourg. And some more examples, this of the more classical variety at the Theater of Celsus in Turkey. These might be familiar to some. The figure on the left, Fortitude, is by Botticelli. And that perchance was a precedent that I used for a project that I did in architecture school. I don't know how I'm going to... this was actually a project at the University of Notre Dame where we were supposed to design a building that would house a banqueting hall for the university. So the building, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this with my cursor, but that's the Golden Dome of Notre Dame. Here's the building I designed, and there's a room up top that features these figures of virtue up in the upper register. So I'm showing my bona fides here. And I was thinking about this way back when, that you could actually have these literal representational figures within the architecture to add to the meaning and depth. Murals within public buildings. This is Siena, showing good allegorical depictions of good and bad government. And other collections of sculpture within architecture, primarily either freestanding or embedded within the architecture, and some familiar figures at the bottom of law and justice at the Supreme Court. Here in ancient Greece, at the Parthenon, we can see some reconstructions of the Panathenaic frieze that has these depictions that are more narrative in their scope and depth than a typical singular statue. That isn't typical, but it does still happen today. This is a sculptural piece by Sabine Howard for the World War I memorial here in Washington, D.C. And then it finds its way into the architecture, if you can notice the theme here, in many different ways, shapes, and forms. This is the OG sgraffito from Italy, that is now in a much more crude form today, but actually rendering the facade of your building with these figures two-dimensionally. Do we do that anymore? I don't think so. I looked a little bit, didn't find anything. Whoops, getting ahead of myself. One reading of art offered by Aristotle is to think of it as truth liberated from experience. I use this often in my classes, like rendering classes in particular, or more artistic courses. He suggests that through imitation of nature as a likeness, not a copy or literal reference to nature, art is able to reveal and amplify a privileged view of something, a truth that is necessarily detached from contingent realities. We don't really think of art as useful, but in some sense, it is a very resourceful and efficient in filtering out a multitude of mundane distractions to guide our attention toward what is important. Oops. Sorry. And actually, this is reminding me of one of the student presentations yesterday on art. There was discussion about, thank you, Aaron. Good to see you. I'm not trying to call you out or anything, but it was a great conversation about what art is. And in this case, the idea of truth liberated from reality, I think, confirms, in a sense, what you were saying about, I forget what the word that you used, or that was used, that it's submissive, not subversive. That in a sense, yes, that does happen, that you're taking the reality and making it something else. And I think it would just be a matter of a take on it with perhaps a negative or a positive term to do that, but certainly it happens. And there the value lies, that you reveal a truth to somebody because you're seeing things in a certain way and making sure that it's focused on in whatever method that you're using. John Singer Sargent in Venice on the right, and random photo of Venice on the left, just to show the difference, the translation from reality to another version of reality. So, while these works of art are impactful representations with intelligible content, there is also somewhat behind the scenes or deeper and more subtle, but arguably more significant impact that occurs. In moving from human beings as models of moral behavior to works of art, we have crossed a threshold of sorts into the realm of the aesthetic. Here it makes sense to introduce these key concepts of aesthetics and beauty and their potential relationships with morality, as well as to evolve the initial analogy of remembering to include imitation and experience, to be more specific, an aesthetic experience of both a passive and active variety. So, what is one thing that we saw with any of those figures, those sculptures or renderings of virtue? The commonality there is beauty. They were all beautiful, at least I hope they were. I tried to keep ugly out of it. Maybe something snuck in there, but the point is that they were all beautiful. And what does this matter? What does it matter that they were beautiful or that we're pleased by them? What does it mean beyond the content of their representation? Most concede the concept of beauty is elusive, and perhaps there is a reason for that. There is a mysterious quality that seems to hint at something beyond our worldly reality and instills in us a sense of wonder. But before we go there, we can hang our philosophical hats on the traditional-minded likes of Aristotle, Alberti, and Aquinas. Philip Bess, a professor at the University of Notre Dame, in his book, Till We Have Built Jerusalem, has referenced all three of these philosophers and collects them pretty succinctly, so I'm using his breakdown of each one of them. The first is Mortimer Adler's characterization of Aristotle's thoughts about beauty, in which he says that we commonly tend to call something beautiful if it is well made and if it gives pleasure. But it is also true that a beautiful thing may fail to please us due to some defect in ourselves. And I might add to that point, a defect in our broader culture may cause us to fail to be pleased by objectively beautiful things. I bring to mind a particular incident that happened in Washington, D.C., where the Josh Bell, the famous violinist, dressed in disguise and played in Washington, D.C.'s metro station for about 45 minutes, where he was all but ignored. Is anybody aware of this? Some years back, but true story. The same, I would observe, happens pretty much everywhere on a daily basis, that we have in our own selves, even myself, I would admit, a lack of ability to see beauty or appreciate beauty. The second characterization of beauty, well known to architects, is Leon Battista Alberti's, who in the 15th century defined beauty as the reasoned harmony of all the parts within whatsoever subject it appears, such that nothing could be added, diminished, or altered but for the worse. And then finally, the third consideration of beauty is that of St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. Aquinas anticipated in his characterization of beauty as demonstrating both the unity and harmony of its components. But Aquinas also added that beauty manifests the virtue of clarity, by which he meant that a beautiful object self-evidently embodies the essence of the kind of thing it is. Among other things, Aquinas' considerations underscore that beauty is not simply in the eye of the beholder, but is also, to some degree, a quality of the object itself. With any one of these three concepts here, we're responding to visual qualities of an object. Inherent within that object, however that is achieved, is a quality of attraction. and is not an intellectual act but a passive, primitive response to an image delivered via sensuous medium. We are, in theory, stopped in our tracks, captured by an arresting image, inviting us towards something else through an aesthetic experience. The late Pope Benedict XVI, then Cardinal Ratzinger, observed that the Greek concept of beauty incorporated an account of being struck, of suffering, and involving a spiritual transcendence that then took a Christian translation with a redemptive dimension. Quote, "The encounter with beauty comes as a shock which takes the individual out of his everyday existence and nurtures in him a longing for the original perfection that was conceived for him and which he has since lost. The shock of the encounter with beauty is like an arrow that pierces man, wounds him, and in this way gives him wings, lifts him upwards towards the transcendent." And in this lies the thesis of my talk. Moving to aesthetics now, a definition as an adjective is the responsive to or appreciation of what is pleasurable to the senses, and the noun, a particular theory of conception of beauty or art, a particular taste for or approach to what is pleasing to the senses, and especially sight. After our attention is arrested, we become active. We start to, dare I say, the J word, judge. I think it is fair to say that aesthetics is commonly thought to be just a matter of subjective taste, and discussion basically stops right there. However, ignoring the reality that we have such a strong human proclivity to be very convicted about aesthetic judgment as to what is right and wrong on the visual stage doesn't sit right. We can't just leave it there. There's something to it. So what's all that about? In short, aesthetic judgment is akin to moral judgment. Reconnecting with Roger Scruton, who in his book Aesthetics of Architecture makes the persuasive case that aesthetic objectivity, like moral objectivity, can be validated through shared agreement absent self-interests. This does not amount to truth or universal law per se, but is granted significance. How this is arrived at is through the authority of everyday people in imaginative contemplation with everyday practical aesthetic experiences. What do I put on today for this event? Where should I put this vase, or what flowers ought to be displayed? And in general, getting things right. All my OCD people out there get this in spades. This particular notion of everyone necessarily being involved and intimate with these acts of taste, and not just the elites or artists of the world, is perhaps what is most fascinating to me about Scruton's concepts of aesthetics here. But again, what does this mean? Sorry, I missed a slide. This is meant to say visually something about the aesthetics of everyday life, featuring Mr. Rogers. So again, what does this mean? What's this value? Is there anything there beyond that? Is it just about something looking good to look good, even if the case for objectivity is admitted? If this is true, we are just talking about aestheticism, which promoted an art for art's sake philosophy, celebrating beauty free of moral considerations. What Roger Scruton is intimating is moral dimension. Quote, "We are following a path of thought from aesthetic taste to practical reason, from the sense of how things should look to the judgment of how they should be. The sense of the appropriate exists as an embodiment of moral thought. In a very real sense, the cultivation of the aesthetic value intrinsic to good manners, the cultivation of visual decorum, is part of a process of bringing order to the otherwise nebulous choice of individual life." At this point, we can walk away with the thought that there exists some sort of answer to right or wrong, that there is some sort of confidence about things being appropriate in terms of aesthetics. So now we move on finally to architecture. And perhaps you're anticipating a trajectory here. What after art possesses a high degree of potential for opportunities to impact our day-to-day lives, to remind and present aesthetic experiences? Architecture, of course. Architecture for our purposes can intentionally be connected to at all ends of the decorative aesthetic spectrum, from the highly formal of the civic government building and churches to the informally practical aesthetics of the private home, and further to the particular presentation of ourselves. We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us, is the often cited quote of Sir Winston Churchill, given in his speech to the House of Lords, imploring that the House of Commons be restored after it was destroyed in the war. And it intimates a sense of a mutually beneficial bound morality between architecture and society. In Roger Scruton's exploration of architectural aesthetics, he first identifies architecture's essence. Architecture, while in the family of the fine arts, is also unique among them. Unlike sculpture, painting, music, poetry, and acting, architecture is not entirely aesthetic. It cannot be divorced from its day job of serving our purposes in terms of accommodating our activities and being well built. For this reason, architecture is primarily a vernacular art. This plays out in how architecture acquires its particular aesthetic character with an essence that combines both functional and aesthetic aims. Dmitri Porphyrios, a contemporary classical architect and theorist, harnesses Aristotelian thought in articulating this concept in philosophical yet concrete terms. Part of the appeal of art and architecture is that they are artifacts. We can recognize them as being from human production, as in the virtue of art. Quote, this recognition is essentially a contemplative experience, and when viewed like this, the building, though it may be useful, refuses to be used in any way. Architecture begins precisely here. It speaks of the usefulness which produced it in the first place, from which it detaches itself as art and to which it always alludes. Traditional architecture, like art, is also truth liberated from experience. What this looks like is arrived at through the concepts of techne and tectonics, or the rational knowledge to make something and the form-giving capacity of the material being used. Architecture presents a truth through knowledge of vernacular building that alludes to the expresses natural principles such as stability through tectonics. The application of these techniques applied to construct standard elements like a gable, a door, a post, a beam with a given material over time gains authority through typicality and begin to assume an iconic status that is culturally recognizable. I've got a few sites here of elements of classical architecture that make the point about tectonics for sure. And again, I could probably spend about 15, 20 minutes on each one of these slides, but the elements that we're looking at reinforce the idea of typicality, that something happens time and time again within a culture that then starts to imbue some significance, and that happens across the board, and notably in columns, for example, and then more notably in the Greek culture that took one thing that seems very simple and basic to us and non-creative in a way, and starts to create a perfection of that particular kind, whether it's the temple or the part of the temple column, or on the slide on the right, you see all these profiles of a capital, like how much energy is invested in these details is insane. We wouldn't do that today, but we should. This is another example of that. You talk about the basic building, walls, openings, roof. Those are typical components of a traditional building, right? That you would have sort of a celebration of any one of those things and then into the details of it. This is an example of some what we call pediments, or the gable ends and openings in the walls that also have a similar treatment. It's sort of like a smaller building within the larger building context. And to reinforce the point about the Greeks' perfection of a kind, just talking with Justin about this, that the Greeks were really, they were sort of conceptually, in perception of their culture and their architecture, thought to be uncreative, when in fact they were really going into detail about trying to create the best effect. That was their end game. It wasn't about just some idea, some concept, but they were like tweaking here and there. In the image to the left is an optical refinement. They looked at this boxy temple that was maybe one of the first versions, and they said, it's kind of static. What can we do here? Let's tilt the columns in. Let's have the base of this whole temple bow. And so that's what you see up here, and that's what they did, is they kept fussing around with it till it was just right. And there's the nitty-gritty and the stuff that I would be teaching to students, is that every single one of these parts of this kind of a building has a name, and it has a reason for being, geometrically, proportionally, all of this stuff. But suffice it to say that that all exists. Again, there's a richness within this, this particular evolvement of architecture through tectonic sensibilities. And then the end game is that it approaches this iconic status. And we're looking at just the temple right now, but there are all these other typicalities in terms of buildings, building typology is what we call it. Whether it's a theater, house, you name it, that those start to establish a recognizable thing, and then just jumping ahead, when you're in a traditional city, it's legible. You can see, oh, that's a bank, that's a school, that's a church, right? Like there's a legibility to it that's important. So, sorry, I skipped ahead. I keep doing that. It was a fun slide. They become recognizable, these iconic temples, in the sense that you experience joy when you unexpectedly, in the same way that you experience joy when you unexpectedly see a friend around town. Yeah, wow, great to see you. This then leads to an impulse to aesthetically celebrate tectonics and make universal and permanent the truths of the building's essence by treating them with formal principles and enrichments that enhance their beauty. What was simply known before is now known in a different, delightful, and commemorative way that can be further imbued with signification and even sacred animation. What comes from this is a dynamic of necessity and freedom. Dmitry Porphyros, in his book Classical Architecture, likens this act of architecture to chess, and having the rules established as binding, but with an admittance of variety through play. Now we can. There are many other things that architecture could be said that it is not. Notably, it is not sculpture, and I think that idea is lost on most today. It is not raw aesthetic expression with programs shoved inside, as we see in many contemporary modernist offerings. I've always found this ironic that modernism expressed as one of its earlier tenets that functionalism be a bastion of truth in architecture, when the lion's share of modernist buildings today are the least functional works of architecture imaginable. Some other differences between architecture and other fine arts is that architecture is a public art, in that it is more public than, say, a painting or music that are privately chosen. In most cases, architecture imposes itself on all people. This raises the stakes on its aesthetic responsibilities. Architecture is also highly localized and is unavoidably related to its site. This can be embraced or ignored by the architect to varying degrees, but it is always a fact on the ground. And finally, architecture is naturally not as personal as the other arts, especially music and painting. For this reason, modernist architects versus modernist artists had to work extra hard in literally bending the building over backwards to make an ideological, individualist point that is more easily made in a private venue with a smaller and more expressionist medium. With a more firm grasp on what architecture is and what it is not, we can move on to the aesthetic experience of architecture and how it relates to morality. First, it is key to understand that in the architectural aesthetic experience, enjoyment and pleasure is paramount. Pleasure is arrived at not by pure passive sensuous acceptance, but through contemplation that cannot be betrayed by false essence, as in, say, a Potemkin village. The experience is essentially an interpretive act that is tied to both the perception of the building itself and our own conceptual conditioning that we bring to the table. Conceptual, perceptual, this is true. Put simply, it is an imaginative experience, not just a literal reading of the facts of the building, but one where our minds fill in some gaps and become attached to the particular perspective. We all have preferences. So, I have a little interactive work for us to do. little play, if you will. So I invite you all to look at these two images, or sorry, this first image here. I've got two images. This is obviously not architecture, but when we're looking at this, I know what the answers are, but starting with the image on the left, I'm curious to know if you all see anything in particular. Okay, anybody want to offer it? A woman? Okay, yeah. What, more? Okay. Gotcha. Anybody else? Any other readings on this? That's right. Yes, I was looking for a young. There's a young woman and an old woman here. And so, same image, both of you came up with a different result. How about the one on the right? This is great. This is exactly what happens. You have to explain to the person how you see it. This is the point, an important one. So the image on the right, what do we see there? Anything? I might have to help. That's more difficult. I'll give it to you for sake of time. There's an old man with a big schnoz right here. And here's his eye, and the other eye over here is in the shadows. And here's his bottom lip, and this is like a beard. Nothing? Trust me, it's there. And then there's one more, and it's an old-young thing. Old guy, I'll do a circle around his face. It's here. Anything else? Bueller? Right here? Nothing? It's a young man, I would say, sort of Jesus-like. Underside of the nose, mouth, chin, cheekbones, eyes. All right. So, too much time on the not architecture part. So, the same experience, to save time, we won't go through the same experiment, but do look at it and think about, and I'll try to talk through how you would be thinking about it. If someone were to ask you to describe what you see most prominently in this work of architecture, not in terms of literal description, but main compositional reading, what might your attention go to? Where would you gravitate and visually reflect? And then intellectually, you would follow that by thinking about what it is that you saw and try to describe that. So that's what we would do, is say, hey, what do you all see here? And in theory, we'll get a lot of different responses because it's more complex. But at the same time, I think we'll have some similar common answers in terms of the reading of it, because there's a lot of intentionality here. But that is simply to make the point about what this imaginative experience is all about, is that we could all go out and look at a bunch of buildings, and it's a fact on the ground, but there are different ways to look at it, and then there's a process that ensues. So, this dynamic ambiguity of free interpretation invites the possibility to engage in reasoned deliberation about other ways to read and appreciate the work, and in theory leading to higher literacy on the subject. The dynamic also suggests that these aesthetic testing grounds of taste imply a right and a wrong, a more or less appropriate answer that is not necessarily written in stone, similar to the previous point made about moral objectivity, and that we are actively involved in the process of developing taste. Taste is a person's liking for particular flavors. According to Scruton, taste is built upon from successive layers of sensuous and intellectual choice. Certain forms appeal to us. We choose them in preference to others, and this phenomenon is primitive in the sense that there's initially no reason why we do this. We begin to search for such reasons, and in the course of doing so, endow our chosen forms with meaning. The result may be the discovery of a style, not as a body of rigid rules, but rather as the creation of an architectural vocabulary. the end point of which is to render an appearance not only comfortable to the uninstructed, but also intelligible to the instructed eye. As first act of a primitive response to by subconscious preference, we are in fact vetting unreasonable options. This speaks to the inclusion of the common person with stake in the game, as compared to the connoisseur being involved in the same act, and that possibly and ideally they are one and the same. We can and arguably ought to train or cultivate our perceptions to better appreciate beauty. If not, we may end up walking past Joshua Bell on the metro. Again, in Scruton words, our preference means something more to us than mere pleasure or satisfaction. It is the outcome of thought and education. It is expressive of moral, religious, and political feelings, of an entire Weltanschauung, and I've got it written down so you can see it, with which our identity is mingled. Our deepest convictions seek confirmation in the experience of architecture. It is simply not open to us to dismiss these convictions as matters of arbitrary preference about which others are free to make up their own mind, any more than it is open to us to think the same of our feelings about murder, rape, or genocide. That cultivation process can be intellectual only, but is arguably most impactful through participation, just as we did a little bit of. In the aesthetics of architecture, an example of constructing a door is given. If we think of ourselves right now hypothetically engaged in the construction of a door, a simple door, and assume the structural needs are already met, we can begin the process of deliberation about how wide and high the door should be. So here we go again. Together, we'll begin. There are 3 door openings here with door surrounds, A, B, and C. We'll just do a quick show of hands. I'll go counterintuitively here. Who, just this primitive act stuff, who is drawn to door C? Okay. Who's drawn to door B? All right. And finally, A. Wow. Okay. I don't have a way to prove this, but I've got some interesting follow-up here that may say whether it's the most appropriate or not. It seemed like the most hands went up for A. So this is a human figure relative to these openings, and I've ascribed some geometries to them, a square and a golden section. 2 squares, for C, there's 2 full squares. This is what's called the golden mean, the golden section, known to be really pure and geometrically attractive. And this is 2 squares plus a little bit. Next to the human being, it appears that that's the better one. And anecdotally, this is actually, it is a literal door. A is a literal door that I measured about a month ago for this building in Georgetown, Van Ness Mausoleum, just to do some historic documentation. So it exists, and I think the A's win. We'll just say that. We'll go forward with A. And then also anecdotally, the structure there is I think, referencing this older temple of ancient virtue in Stowe, Buckinghamshire in England. Both of them Tholos typologies, but I thought that was interesting, totally incidental. Okay. So, ultimately, this creative process manifests a visible, intelligible narrative that can have the reflective effect Churchill speaks of, to help in the act of self-realization and understanding our place in a given community, to take part in an order greater than ourselves, such as the act that we engaged with together. Intelligibility and being a recognizable human artifact is key. Is key in this conversation about morality and needing to be able to impart values through empathy. The paragon of intelligible architecture is classical architecture, not only in its comprehensiveness across time and place, but also because of this notion of tectonics and authenticity with respect to the nature of architecture. It embodies the well-known universal architectural principles propagated by the one and only Vitruvius of firmness, commodity, and delight. What ancient Greek culture achieved was replicated In ancient Rome, the Renaissance, other classical derivative architectural cultures like the Gothic, and any traditional vernacular or formal building culture up to our modern era. Any and all of them could be characterized as having a human aesthetic, composed by objective principles of aesthetics that resonate with humanity through the use of particular cultural language to produce ordered, legible, beautiful, meaningful, and timeless buildings. Dmitri Porphyros, whom I've already quoted, reinforces this point. That is what makes us call classical whatever is retrieved from the vicissitudes of changing time and changing taste. That is why the term classical always points to something enduring with a significance that is independent of all circumstances of time. In those things we name classical, we recognize a kind of timeless present that is contemporaneous and at ease with every historical period. That is why I have insisted on so many occasions on the rhetorical expression classicism is not a style. Classicism carries with it the value of universality through legibility and acquires a law-like quality, which in turn gives the world a canon of appropriateness in architecture. I'll take a brief detour here to contemplate the value of architecture. To this point, there's a convincing case to be made that aesthetic objectivity can be achieved, and that what we are serious about, our aesthetic convictions. It is also true that historically, aesthetic things that are beautiful are the most sustainable, and enduring. The strength of this quality and support it garners might lead someone to say that this is a valid, authentic good for all human beings in all times and places. Phil Best, in his book Until We Have Built Jerusalem, has made the observation that mixed-use, walkable settlements falls in the same category of being good for human beings in all times and places. He identifies this as the definition of a natural law. To this proposal, I might add that good architecture, which can be objectively identified, can be considered a contender for that same status. We saw in our first aesthetic experience with art literal reminders of virtue through representation. When considering the medium of architectural aesthetics, we are dealing with something different. In architecture, the object of the work is the beginning and the end. It does not suggest narrative like a painting that can lead your thought away from the object, but remains in the object itself, either through the use of imitation or by employing expression. Expression in this case refers to reference. A great example of this is Michelangelo's Medici tomb, which expresses and refers to a somberness, but does not describe that quality. This quality is intrinsic to the object of architecture and arousing certain feelings through association. The way a building looks, sounds, feels to us is essential. Scruton recognized that while some of this can be conveyed via image, it cannot be entirely appreciated unless you are physically present to take in the varied dynamics of perception. The experience of Chartres in the apprehension of the divine light penetrating all things of matter, made permeable to the soul, of a universal harmony which transforms every stone from its material roughness into a minute symbol of the intellectual love of God. But to understand it fully, nothing short of a visit to Chartres will suffice. However intellectual the content of aesthetic experience, it is the experience which remains the important thing. Aesthetic understanding is a practical matter. It consists not in theoretical knowledge, but in the organization of perception and feeling. To grasp the expressive character of a building is to feel its significance, to know what its character is like, to feel the inward resonance of an idea or way of life. One does not learn about medieval theology from Chartres, but does learn what it is like to believe in it. Architecture, as the central object of attention, is used to render meaning through expression. That meaning can be translated to an architectural morality through the medium of feeling in the given aesthetic experience. Expression can be found in compelling subconscious ways. Ann Sussman and Justin Hollander, in their book Cognitive Architecture, direct their research to analyze and understand the cognitive responses of people to the built environment through neuroscience. Their findings are fascinating and point to some empirically backed observations that suggest, for example, that we're inclined towards anthropomorphic qualities, like bilateral symmetry, which probably is not a surprise, as in the face on buildings. Yes, that's correct. Yep. Further, there are natural tie-ins that traditional architecture inherently possesses with architectural elements such as the column and principles such as tripartition that we saw already in some of the Greek images earlier, and looking at the proportions of any of these elements and the relationship of parts, that there's definitely some sort of anthropomorphic intentionality there. Empathetic expression of architecture clearly imitates our own proclivities to express ourselves in a compositional sense. Architecture achieves this, like human beings do, by answering many questions about taste. A work of architecture ultimately needs to be complete in its essence, from the overall proportion of form to relationship of parts to the details. A final important point is that much significance of architectural aesthetics lies in the details, that very thing that the modernists wanted to do away with and execute. It is at this point that we have responded in part to any critique of aestheticism. There is more to this than taste. Taste, as we have seen, can lead us, however, blindly to determine satisfying experiences where architecture can weigh in on ideas of morality through its very object of expression, but also through its process of consensus and virtuous action in making art and architecture. All I have now, quote, all I have now is the experience of what I make, to engage now with those parts of my life which are not of immediate practical interest, to absorb into the present choice of the full reality of a life which stretches into distant moral space. I must lift that experience out of the immediate and transform it into a sign of something universal, hence my need as a rational creature for a concept of the appropriate, a concept that can be applied directly to experience so as to transform it into a sign of permanent values. The architectural aesthetic experience begins with that necessary act of beauty, which, while being rendered useless, is the agent leading to the most purposeful end. We began with encountering the moral person as model, then we crossed the threshold into the aesthetic with narrative, and just now we placed ourselves at the doorstep of architecture. The path we have conceptually been traveling down this whole time is this, a neighborhood street within a city. This brings us to our final resource of being reminded, exhorted, and compelled to act toward a moral and virtuous end. The city is arguably the most impactful in terms of quantity of architecture writ large in impacting our daily lives, but more importantly as a symbol of a higher moral calling. To reiterate, human beings are social animals inextricably tied to practice, practices, relationships, and roles. The good life through virtue is played out in communities, and the largest and most significant of those communities is the community of communities, the city. Phil Bess, in his book, covered much of this territory in the promotion of traditional cities, where specific practices require specific virtues. Making and sustaining families, for example, require the virtues of charity, patience, and steadfastness. And making and sustaining cities require the citizens and rulers the virtues of temperance, friendship, magnanimity, and prudence. Practices are themselves microcosms of communities within which one can experience individual freedom or liberty of the variety contrary to today's conceptions of freedom. The philosophical and cultural context being described here is accommodated in the built reality of traditional cities. The diagram of this is seen in the types of buildings and their expression. Private commercial buildings that are for domestic sustaining or commercial purposes are in the background, as it were. Civic public buildings are foreground buildings in significant locations, and less frequent and public spaces are made available for the array of social interactions necessary for the good life. Within this context, the hierarchy that is afforded the civic buildings is a reflection of legitimate authority or trustworthiness of the agencies that are given the responsibilities to act on behalf of the citizenry. These buildings are expected to reflect the values and virtues of the community and thus are rendered with a more monumental and formal architectural expression. While the architecture itself could express morality, it is also like the sculptures of virtues that we saw in presenting an image or symbol of virtue that becomes transformed via its formal capacity into something civic, representing the moral order of the city, an order neglected in cities today. It's important here to say, perhaps the obvious, that it is the culture that makes this happen, that makes it authentically possible, where the beautiful and moral city is born from these values. Absent that culture, this can be formally replicated, as in the case of current-day efforts to make walkable, mixed-use, traditional articulated places in something that's called new urbanism, or there are new towns in Florida, for example, Seaside. But they're minus a key ingredient, that is the moral culture that would be found in a more traditional culture, which is ultimately the catalyst to the completion of this place. This is the difference between replication and emulation. It's also important to say that just because a person or people are moral, it does not equate immediately to beauty or morality in architecture or a city. Again, to quote Scruton, "For while aesthetic values contain an intimation of the moral sense, moral values do not in turn contain any intimation of their aesthetic embodiment, and that is why they're good people with appalling taste." End quote. One can engage in questions of why a certain culture is able to produce beautiful built environments. We could ask why Greek culture, for example, got things so right. Was it the cultural ethos of humanism, spiritualism, excellence, and pride? Is that all just in the water? I think we can say yes, and that would be the case for ancient and Renaissance Rome and the Gothic invention, to name a few. Suffice it to say that authentic traditional cultures have a strong proclivity towards and success in creating beautiful places. An important aspect of the aesthetic act is act of making lies in the communal buy-in. The shared effort toward communal purpose has significant implications on its own. It is an act of love. This dynamic happens in the city context, and going back to that public place of the street where we saw that street image, with unity of public outer faces, facades along the street, while knowing that there's an inner dimension as well that speaks to our own duality and desires to be both autonomous beings and relational at the same time. Each facade is not an egocentrical, individualistic show, but rather an aesthetic social gesture of respect in dressing up, as an expression of good manners and agreement in contributing to a public alignment. Cityscapes today are largely not that, and inclined to be something more like this, with a lack of public space, lack of shared aesthetic continuity, lack of institutional hierarchy, and again, quoting Scruton, utopian schemes demonstrating in their every aspect the triumph of that collective individualism from which both community and individual are abolished. It is surely absurd to think of the popular outrage at these things as no more than a matter of taste, rather than a reaffirmation of injured moral feelings. No problem is more important politically, morally, spiritually, or aesthetically than that posed by the degradation of the urban fabric. Which brings us to today. In contrast to the dominant theme of traditional concepts that have been outlined so far, the phenomenon of individualism and relativity, moral or otherwise, is in today's culture, and as identified presciently by Alexis de Tocqueville, can be traced across the board in all facets of society. Architecture is no exception. The state creates a fracturing of the very principles of community and individual pursuit of virtue that traditional architecture and cities depend on. The cult of individuality and relativity in architecture found its springboard historically through the modernist movement that was imported from Europe via the Bauhaus school. Contemporary architectural culture is largely influenced by modernist architecture. Developed in the early 20th century as a wholly new architecture, it is a complete departure from the past, intended to supplant tradition to a point of being irrelevant, avowing the notion that architecture must always privilege the new as intrinsically superior to the old. Classical and traditional architecture are often dismissed with the irrational but devastating critique of not being of our time. Modernist design can be characterized as a machine aesthetic, emphasizing technology, influence in being, minimal, sterile, systematized, tectonically pure, and without human reference. It also tends towards arbitrary, emotive, and ephemeral. The urban context tends to be autonomous, self-referential, and non-communicative, as well as anti-spatial. Modernism can be seen and experienced in ubiquity around the world among the cultural elites in charge of new public buildings, and the fact that the vast majority of architecture schools have intentionally excluded traditional design. This concerted effort to intentionally undermine all things traditional in the profession and throughout academia can be traced even further back to the 18th century with a multifaceted revolutionary reaction to the Baroque and Rococo architecture, resistance to classical canon, the Industrial Revolution's effect on urban living and new construction material and technology, and perhaps most significantly, the renunciation of institutionalized allegiance to the moral order of religion through the lens of Enlightenment thinking. On a material level, concepts of traditional tectonics and permanence were threatened by blind acceptance of new and novel materials towards architectural obsolescence. Other social, economic, and health-related negative impacts of the Industrial Revolution are well known, leading to new conceptual solutions such as utopian communities and suburban desirability. Enlightenment concepts of morality have shifted from a selfless, community-dependent Aristotelian model to an internal emotive search for self that was set on indulging pleasure and avoiding suffering. Nature was a targeted solution, leading to an obsession with the sublime. Aesthetic adrenaline junkies looked to satiate emotional extremes in compensating for the void left by religion. The key architectural figure in this was Giovanni Battista Piranesi, whose Capriccio mind and drawings capturing the sublime were of great influence in establishing the idyllic, romantic, and picturesque movement. Through scientific discoveries to include archaeology and a new mentality was born, eager to dismiss the authority and upset the reverence for classical culture intent on breaking with traditional concepts of taste and universality. One key example of this is seen in England, where the government, in shifting towards a more national democratic identity, conjured an architectural style that would represent this new era. While they turned to classical Palladianism, the move was a hollow mark of enlisting aesthetics for ideology. The natural world through landscape had significant implications that were tied to a new interest in other cultures, such as China, toward eclecticism that was featured in landscape design. Two key themes from this have impacted modernist thought. That architecture ought to be expressive, and that architectural historicism and diversity is an essential good. Ruins for the Renaissance were objects of instruction. In this era, they held moral implications as objects of fascination for ideas of mortality and historicism that were indicative of a deference to moodiness and a life bound and defined by one's time on this earth. Architecture, through all of this, may have gained in more symbolic capacity through central character, but was becoming more absent of moral implication as tied to community and the act of aesthetic judgment. It was in this environment that a shift to architect as the sole arbiter of taste and not the layperson was established. These were the beginnings of what could be characterized as the incoherent, indifferent architectural trajectory, where aestheticism and functionalism are mute with respect to morality. Today's scene reflects the erosion of the social realm, to which I referenced the thoughts of Hannah Arendt. This is the real ground zero attack on aesthetics. If we have no public realm, we have no ability to exercise communal acts of aesthetic judgment and implicative morality in making places we love. So, this is the conclusion here. Leading up to this point, all that has been said about architecture and its relationship with morality has been in a supportive role, a reminder, a facilitator, and an intimation of morality. It is not moral, nor does it assure morality. Architecture or city is just inanimate material, I say this because there seems to always be lurking the seduction of enlisting architecture and aesthetics into ideological solutions to social issues. Architecture is being asked to do things that institutions in the past were poised and prepared to do. It is compensatory and akin to kitsch in the world of aesthetics. Architects need to navigate the waters between the cult of the ugly and the cult of aestheticism. The issue, put plainly in my view, is that today culture at large does not support traditional objective principles of communal morality, a much larger discussion, but one that has obvious implications for an architecture that was cut from that cloth. This has led to a distorted view of what architecture actually is or ought to be. And lastly, even if we admit objective morality in our lives in, say, traditional circles, the notion of architecture's potential to impact morality and a life of virtue are at best underestimated and more likely entirely dismissed. I'm not so bold as to suggest that there's any one solution, but there are certainly things that can be done or can be explored in reference to the virtue of hope. I would like to offer these thoughts through some of the questions that were posed for this presentation that I was given. Question 1. Yep, there they are. How can architecture morally uplift a people and a culture? The cultivation and awareness of all people's capacity and further responsibility to engage in aesthetic judgment and action is sneaky powerful. It's like one of those things where someone says if everybody just does one good act a day for a whole year, our world would be in a better place. It's similar to that sort of concept. If everyday people assume this role, more people would come to see and appreciate the value of beauty with the assumption that most people intuitively appreciate traditional architecture and urbanism. Just ask NCAS. I believe this impact would be felt at the top. The hegemony of elites that tend to make decisions for everybody would presumably dissipate. More importantly, it would set the table for communal act, and then eventually beauty would be more present in a more authentic way, which of course, as Churchill's sentiments indicate, would lead to architecture reciprocating to help morally uplift its people and culture. What has me bullish on this is that traditional urbanism, as we see in new urbanism, has seen great success in appealing to common people with common sense about good things, as in the natural law theory. Related to this point, essentially about education, I would propose that formal education towards this end be made more robust. To train architects is to train and affect the direction of the profession. Traditional presence in the architecture schools is meager, but it has made some headway, as in the case of CUA, where I'm currently teaching. But much more can be done and should be done on that front. And I do have, I'm going to really fly through these because I know I'm going long, some examples of student work, just to give you a sense of what's happening at the school. And there's something of a chronology here in terms of simpler to more complex student projects from freshman year to graduate work, which could be its own presentation. But it's wide-ranging, and this example shows it's not just about the architecture, it is about the urbanism that's part of this, not only pedagogy, but part of our curriculum. And it is not just classicism as well. We use that for specific reasons. It's the best way to teach and has particular principles. But it extends out to derivatives such as the Gothic architecture, the Gothic language. Which brings us to the profession. Classical traditional architecture has a rocky story, as in Sylvester Stallone. It has been up and down, knocked this way and that, but is resilient for reasons that have already been touched upon. This means that there is always hope, as contemporary classical architect Alan Greenberg has astutely observed. The classical language of architecture is always modern because it is rooted in the psychology and physiology of the individual human being. Classical architecture is the most comprehensive architectural language that human beings have yet developed. 3 millennia of Western architecture, which is largely a history of classical architecture, demonstrate how successfully this classical language has responded to building needs in diverse political realms, cultures, climates, and geographies. Question number 2. How would our architecture and art be different if based not upon the idyllic or its rejection, but upon real beauty contextualized to place and time? I interpret this question to refer to aestheticism as a hollow, non-moral architectural product. To arrive at an antidote to aestheticism is to engage with the authentic. Phil Bess, who in referencing philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre's assessment of modern culture being not unlike the culture before the fall of Rome, presented a hypothetical option called the Benedictine option. While the monastery is the model, the idea would be to take on different contemporary forms, all of which would seek to form discerning small moral traditional communities that would be poised to more easily realize a traditional culture within which morality and the architectural and urban environment would be nourished. If traditional cities and architecture are to be more than escapist fantasy, they must be rooted in the deepest intellectual understanding of the great inherited tradition of aesthetic judgment. From this, one could expect the form of the polis, the notion of the city as a place for virtuous, happy living. And I use as an accompanying image here, actually my graduate thesis project, I designed a whole village for graduate students, of which I was one, graduate students with family. So the proposal, in short, was that people at the university would live here, students, of course, but then pretty much anybody else, but that you would have this core of people that have a lot in common and are thinking about things like the good life. So that's a possibility in terms of that particular solution idea. All right. So question 3, final question. How does a moral vision shape the expression of beauty? This somewhat naturally leads to the implicit trajectory of all these thoughts. The idea of arriving at a confidence in the authority of objective morality and aesthetics originally struck me as uncomfortable. Shouldn't we have a more definitive law-like answer? But the more I considered its nature, and the more I realized that it is a totally human thing to do. To admit human agency, this gets particularly poignant when compared to the controlling, empirical, rationalist absolutism that exists today, which is uncomfortable with the messiness of humanity. The reality of humanity is that there is this mysterious dimension of the unknown that speaks to transcendence and the sacred. From Egyptian pyramids to basilicas throughout time, the purpose for buildings seems to truly reflect not just function, but function plus a useless, quote-unquote, ritualistic dimension that can't be ignored. When we talk about the aesthetic experience and everyday acts of individuals, we are suggesting that act is, as practical as it is a small gesture of consecration. Sacred acts, big and small, are anticipatory in nature. There always remains an unexplained longing that leaves us perpetually unsatisfied. To return to the definitions of beauty, and specifically Thomas Aquinas' account of beauty and concepts of integritas, constantia, and claritas, we can think of beauty needing to be whole, harmonious, and radiant. These ideas were definitely wed to the ideas espoused by Abbot Suger in forming the Gothic for churches to ultimately imitate heaven. The job of sacred architecture of this sort was to make a house for God, but also to implore people in an evangelical sense towards morality to first be affected by their experience, which would then lead them to see that it is good, and then know the truth. This incarnational act is at the high side of consecrating our world, which in turn reminds us, like an arrow through the heart, that there is something beyond, but only if we put our heads down, acknowledging that there is work still to be done. Thank you.